From the nation's capital, welcome to Your Source TV. Be empowered, encouraged, and inspired to look beyond the ordinary. Welcome to Your Source TV. I'm Tamara Stuchlak, and in this segment we speak with Laurie Nakomoto, who has multiple professions and has had a fascinating life's journey. So Laurie, let's jump right in, and you're going to tell us a little bit about your early life. And again, you are a social worker, an art docent, an art collector, a world traveler, massage therapist, and a licensed skin professional. So we're going to learn all about you in this segment, and really I believe that people will come away with knowing about your innovation and have an inspiration about putting their passions together. So your early life.
My early life began in Montana as a small girl growing up. All the American middle-class experiences that children have, piano lessons, ballet, dance lessons, and then moved to Seattle when I was in junior high and had that experience of what was city life at that time. Now it's really city life. And just enjoying the middle class experiences as a young girl.
So, and these early, life experiences, how did they touch off, sort of the art docent and art history and these people that you met that have influenced your life?
Going back with art history, I can remember going to a museum in Montana as a little girl, and it was one of artifacts, people and rooms. And I used to go with a neighbor whom I adored. And it was just fascinating. I could go back there again and again. And then when I walked home from school, there was a museum with Charlie Russell. He was a great Western artist in the West. And I remember stopping in there, looking at the art, walking by. And then in college, I worked in a museum on campus, so I was around the museum world, and it always fascinated me. And one of my big moments when you talk about people who made an impression and you always carried that image with you,
yes,
is going to an art museum in Seattle that again had American history, artifacts, the first trolley and city life and how people dressed and all. And I remember looking at this one docent one time and thinking, oh, she's so beautiful, I want to be just like her. And I think I was 12 years old. I can remember the tour, I remember the day, and it always stuck in my mind. And as I got older and then moved to Washington, the perfect city for museums,
yes,
I started taking adult education classes, and I had always told myself when I was 30, I was going to become one of those women, an art docent. And I have no idea who that lady was, but she was my turning point in the art world. I remember that moment.
Wow, that's wonderful. Let's tie this in with your beliefs, even as a young person, and how they have, woven through your choices and these journeys that you've had.
Well, those journeys, I think, in my childhood, made it very fascinating to see people interpreting art and being in these museums with all these artifacts. It was exciting. And then when I became 30, living in Washington, I said, it's time. I'm going on that goal that I always had. And I looked around the city, and I'd been taking all these courses in modern art. And at the end of the classes, I was more confused than I was at the beginning, just trying to put it together. And I'd been at the Hirshhorn a lot, so I thought, why don't I try this museum, modern, contemporary art, the latest, cutting edge. I started there 36 years ago.
Had you already done your travel and already been doing some art collecting?
No, my travels were way before I got to Washington. During college, I was fortunate to have study abroad in France, in Mexico. I learned how to travel in the 60s.
And what does that mean?
Well, traveling in the 60s mean you had very little money, you did youth hostels, you hitchhiked.
Was it safe?
At that time it was. You had to learn the norms and how to do it. At first, a lot of us women would travel with guys, and pretty soon we learned how to travel with women. You had to know that you had an angel. I've always had an angel with me. Never had any bad experiences that were awful. Traveled a lot in Europe that way during my studies, and then I wasn't ready to settle down. I was too restless. I had this energy. I wanted to get out there in the world. And so I traveled about 2 years between undergraduate and graduate school. And I took jobs along the way, had a one-way ticket one time when I went to Europe, had no idea how long I'd stay. I was there for over a year and a half.
So what belief would have you do that?
I think my belief and my fascination was just to get out there and see the world. I lived in tiny communities where you didn't have foreign people. And I got to college, and there were all these foreign students. I was active.
What did you study?
I was liberal arts, and had a great time at that. That was the time when you could make your own courses, and I was fascinated. I was in almost every committee I could be on campus, and every club. I looked like a hippie, but I was in a sorority, so I was a very straight person, but liked to touch on the edges of things, and just part of that movement.
Were there any treasured pieces that you collected, and why were you drawn to those?
Really, my art collecting happened more in adulthood when I became settled. In my first marriage, my husband thought he had married a free spirit, which I was, in my late 20s. And then I got settled, and I enjoyed being a consumer and saw a whole different side of the world. And that's when I was able to start buying art. And I can tell you the first paintings I ever purchased, I still have them, and they're very special. I look at them, they have stories. Art speaks to all of us. And when I go into a museum, I go into an art exhibit, an art gallery, and if there's a painting, a sculpture that speaks to me, it haunts me, and I know somehow I have to have it. It just is there, it consumes me. And I go back and I figure out, how can I make room in my house, and how do I have the budget for it?
So is that part of what the story that you create when you're an art docent? Because painting and art speaks to you.
They do.
You bring that into.
And I've been so fortunate to be part of a lot of our local museums with different themes. The Women's Museum, for example, I've been there from the beginning.
In Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. And being part of that museum all these years and seeing what women have done since the 1500s into today in the cutting edge, I've learned so much about myself as a woman, women's role in the world. It's just created so many openings, and to be able to share it with people, that I'm there for art exhibits that I get to learn and share with visitors that come.
Are there some noteworthy exhibitions that you have been a docent that just sparked your passion? And
well, they're all very special, and all the museums I'm in have different themes, different focuses. Recently, the Women's Museum had a wonderful exhibit on women photographers from the Arab world and from those parts of the world where we haven't heard from those young women, and their struggle between their traditions, their history, their defined roles as women, and now looking at the real world, going to universities in the Western world, to London and New York and Boston, and learning, hey, there's a different way of looking at it. It's the same excitement that probably the French Impressionists had when they saw all the African art coming in, and they saw the woodblock prints from Japan, and they had these new ideas. And being in the museums, there's something that always opens you up. And when you're sharing it with people, you learn so much as the docent, and we all learn together. It's very exciting.
Let's move on to your profession as a social worker and how that has been part of the pulse of your combining art history, and the healing arts.
Exactly. Well, I've always loved working with the elderly, and I took a course at the University of Michigan after my 2 years of traveling. One of the first schools that offered a gerontology certificate program. That's back in the 70s. And then I knew that I went to Peace Corps for a while and realized that 2 years in Peace Corps was going to keep me
Where
2
were you
years.
at?
I was in North Africa, in Tunisia.
Wow.
And I had been to North Africa in my travels, because when I traveled Europe, I went to the Near East, and North Africa was a lot of countries. And it was just very exciting to blend all of this together, and I was able to do it.
What was your role as a Peace Corps worker?
Oh, I was working in a role with teaching kids to speak English. And I always, in high school, I always had that the slogans from Peace Corps. The Peace Corps lady taught me to write my name, and I taught her to say it. And the other one that just inspired me, I couldn't wait to be a Peace Corps worker, was the Peace Corps worker is not going to change the world, but they're not going to leave it the same either.
Yes.
And I think that's what got me in social work. So I was restless, I was on the move, so I dropped Peace Corps early and went to graduate school knowing that was the only way I was going to get to the elderly more quickly, and I knew that the elderly were the people I'd work with, and you had to have a degree.
Because of your early experiences with elders? Mm-hmm. Talk about that.
My grandmother was the first one. She was so special. And my grandmother was so close to me that I called her by her first name. I called her grandmother too, but we were best of friends growing up, and she nurtured me, she encouraged me. My grandmother was significant. And then I had a series of other very important older people in my life. In college, I met an elderly woman who did a lot with a lot of classes I was in with community outreach, and she was inspiring. I could tell a story about her. And then I had another friend in high school and college who was an older man, and he created an environment for young people to stop by and have a drink of beer or coffee, and he would talk about everything he read.
Talk about life.
Yep, he talked about life, he shared life, he had college students coming, and everybody knew if they went to Albert's on Friday night or Saturday night, it was like a date out, it was an event, and so he was very inspiring to me.
Are there some beliefs that were formed then, or some
Well, I think my
ideas?
grandmother and Albert said, you know, go out and do whatever you want to do, you know, that you see a vision, go after it. And I think it helped me. I think with my beliefs, I had certain things I wanted, and I did it. I went into gerontology when it wasn't fashionable, it wasn't popular.
As an innovator, which is a theme through your life, an early innovator.
I was one of the first who was trained. And a lot of other things I've done, even my massage. I took massage when there was one school in the metropolitan Washington area, Baltimore, Annapolis. There was nothing else clear by. I went into it when nobody was doing it. Now there's so many schools, you can do one every other mile.
So we're coming to a close with this first half of this segment, and then we're going to bring in your wonderful dog, and you're going to talk more about how you have integrated your social work with the healing arts and your art and docent work. So we have time for you to tell us just a little bit about back to some beliefs and ideas that have brought you to where you are today.
Well, I think where we are as adults, especially myself, my beliefs about myself and the world and my concept of what was out there started very early, and knowing that I could gravitate to do whatever I want. But I wasn't sure about the labels. I didn't know about social workers as a little girl. I had no idea. But I knew that I was going to be a therapist or a psychiatrist. I didn't know what quite that was, but I used to watch a TV program, 11th Hour. You can't even find information on it now, it's so old. Had a gorgeous theme song. And it was, each week it was about a therapist and the client, and it walked through their issues and then had a happy ending. And I thought, early and I was probably 12 or 13, I thought, I'm going to do that. Well, I didn't know about social workers, so now I'm a social worker, and that's really the belief of working with people and being in that kind of situation happened way back before I even knew what that meant as a social worker.
Fantastic. So we're going to go to break now, and we'll see you again.